Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this first episode of Beyond the Screen. We're very excited to have Jess King, who is an author, an educator, a filmmaker, and someone I've had the privilege of knowing for a few years now. We met at a crazy, tiny little film festival in Pepin, Wisconsin. They have a new book out right now, Inclusive Screenwriting for Film and Television. And I'm just excited to kind of have this conversation because it's something that obviously is very important to me as a writer and a filmmaker. And really excited to finally, what I found with this book is just you put words to things that I kind of was intuitively doing, but didn't know how to necessarily, or know that I needed to articulate it more. And so I'm really curious, what made you want to write this book and write it now?
Yeah, thank you for that. And also, I just want to say thank you all for coming. I know today is a really hard day for reproductive justice, following on the heels of lots of assaults on trans healthcare, criminalization of Black and Indigenous lives. Like the fact that you're all here today, just thank you for being here, and just know also what we're going to talk about today is part of the fight against those fascistic, hetero-patriarchal, white supremacist forces. So in terms of why did I want to write this book is because we live in a fascist nightmare, number one, and our media perpetuates narratives in this very deep structural way that support that violence. And I want to change the world. I want to heal the world. I believe that narrative, I believe that media has the power to reshape the cultural imaginary. But we cannot do that unless we really deeply examine the paradigmatic rules of screenwriting. And so I feel what I noticed, because over the past, let's say like 10-ish years, we have seen positive, I would say, increases in representation in film and television. Television is way ahead of the game. Film is still rather conservative. And we've had some, I think, like good public discussions that Hollywood has responded to coming out of like Oscar So White and the Me Too movement and all of that. And there's a lot of discussions around, in particular, visible representation. So then we're talking about like on screen, like who's being cast, and then behind the scenes, who are the writers, the directors, the studio executives, and all of this, and sort of changing that dynamic. And those conversations, of course, are incredibly important. What I found missing, though, was a deep structural analysis of the actual craft of screenwriting. We have a little bit of those kinds of analyses in like cinematography when we talk about like the male gaze, for example, but we don't have any kind of sustained interrogation of screenwriting practices. And so I wanted to bring like queer, anti-racist, feminist, intersectional feminist in particular critiques to the screenwriting paradigms in order to sort of like break apart their power and get screenwriters to start imagining otherwise.
One thing that you talk about in the book that I thought was kind of a little bit of an aha moment was character versus characterization. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, that to me is very striking. So within the screenwriting pedagogy, whether it's within like the way it's taught in universities or whether it's coming out of like screenwriting manuals, there's this really strong distinction between character and characterization. And character is sort of the end all be all, where that's what the screenwriter's whole goal is, to create a character. And that character has to be able to be boiled down to some kind of particular essence. And that this idea of a singular essence comes about through confronting the character with problems through a series of obstacles, increasing in intensity to arrive at that final conflict that they then dominate, master to become like themselves in some kind of way. And so that's what gets talked about a lot, because as you can see, the way I just described that, that's tying in, narrative structure, it's tying in the role of conflict to character in a very tight way, we'll say. And then sort of directly opposed to that, or another way to think about it is like underneath that, is where they talk about characterization. And characterization is like, your race, your gender, your sexuality, your height, your weight, And the way that these aspects of a person's identity are talked about is as if they are just decoration, as opposed to formative aspects of self. Because, we just found out today with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, right? Like being a woman or a person who can become pregnant in this world right now in America now has become immensely more difficult. Many pregnant people's lives are going to change drastically, right? And so this idea that like your gender doesn't matter is absurd, right? You're right. The idea that race doesn't matter is absurd. And so much of screenwriting practice is around this sort of universal neutral idea of character that can be boiled down to some essence like courageous or heroic or, evil, and doesn't take into account that we cannot pour all human lives into this same universal mold. And so I talk about character versus characterization, and I very much want to undo this notion that characterization is secondary to character.
You use Killing Eve as kind of like a cautionary tale in that, in a part of that understanding with Sandra Oh's character, right? Like that it was thought about that her being Korean American was kind of like an afterthought, and therefore was there a missed opportunity for a deeper story or a deeper understanding or understanding of that character to have that be a part of who she is rather than what felt like window dressing?
The show, that no one talks about the fact that the original story of Killing Eve was written by a cis straight white man, right? And then it got adapted into a television show by a bunch of cis white straight women. Then in Hollywood, and I know that's a British BBC show, but similar enough.
Right.
Within the studio system, like colorblind casting is seen as this somehow is heralded as this like progressive way to do things, right? At this whole idea of like, we don't see color, which we know is deeply problematic and deeply harmful. And, when they got Sandra Oh in the role of Eve, that was a huge get. They were very happy with her, like, cultural capital or cachet, right? But then no one went ahead and like thought about how the character might need to be rewritten to accommodate her specific identity. And you don't really see that in the show until the second season. You start seeing like really tiny, honestly, like breadcrumbs of acknowledgement. And all of those came from Sandra Oh herself, who had to fight. And even with her stature, still had to fight to get those things in the narrative. And it's insulting.
Yeah.
And I do think, if you've read the book, like the show, I think, is way lesser for it. Like the show is hugely problematic, even though it masquerades itself as this big progressive piece of work.
Right. And, I think a great example of a show that did it better was with Sandra Oh in it was The Chair. I don't know if you saw that show,
yes,
but that her Korean Americanness was a huge part of everything about that motivated her, that had her place in the world. And I felt it was a better show because of it, because I felt like we were understanding her on such a deeper level.
Absolutely. Yeah, that show actually did take that. They took her gender into account. Race and gender were very much a part of the narrative fabric of that show. Right. And you're right. As a result, it's a much better series for it.
It's interesting if you're a writer director, you have a little bit of freedom if you choose that you don't like money, or you have a little bit more freedom, as you and I know, where we can really push boundaries of story and kind of like be outside a little bit more of the traditional system with the kinds of stories that we tell. You teach students at DePaul University. What do you tell your students if they're going to go to the industry, like they're going to go to Hollywood, they want to be a part in New York, or, and they want to be as a writer? How do they play in the sandbox while still taking these ideas and trying to push it into a better world?
One thing that always holds true is practice your craft, develop your voice. And I do think distinct voices and mastery of the actual like words on the page comes through. So even if you're pushing boundaries, as someone like Michaela Cole is doing, she's not doing that as a mess of a writer, right? She's doing that as a extremely competent writer. And when you're competent, when you know your voice, when you have something to actually say, if within that you're also pushing boundaries, no one's actually going to notice that you're pushing boundaries, because your point of view is coming through, your unique idea is coming through. That's what, and I do think, obviously there's always going to be some aspect of the studio system that just wants to like replicate what's already been done, because, that's this whole producer's game that, dictates like the success of the past will be the success of the future. But there's also a lot of avenues for people with unique voices to get, staffed on shows, or to get, first opportunities. So things like that. And then the other thing I tend to advocate for as well, I always advocate for like a multi-pronged approach. Like, I think, yes, you should always be writing. And you should also always be networking and meeting people. And then if possible, you should be making samples of your work, so that you can see how it translates onto the screen. And if you can get those things out there and get traction with it, it raises, all of those things raise your chances of breaking into the industry. And I don't think it's impossible. I mean, especially now, I think, especially in television, because there's all of these platforms need so much content, and unique voices are coming to the fore.
We're both educators and teaching screenwriting, and something, that I was really thinking about a lot while reading your book is, one, just like, I kind of always knew it, but just like really seeing the misogyny that comes through the traditional screenplay format, and how we're taught about 3-act structure, and how we're given the fundamentals. And again, we can talk, I also want to talk a little bit about like agency and that sort of thing, and how our stories are geared around towards winning battles and being aggressors. And that's how we're triumphant. When you're teaching students and because I'm also teaching students that are really at a base level, like sometimes I don't even know what their education level is coming in, because I teach incarcerated women and youth. This, the ideas that you present in the book are kind of like almost like the graduate level class. How do you teach the beginnings screenwriting fundamentals while trying not to fall into the traps?
Well, I teach both within the university, and then I also do a lot of like community teaching. And so when I'm in a position of teaching the fundamentals, and this is hard. So what I do is I do teach the fundamentals, but with critique. So I talk about like, these are the rules of screenwriting. This is what a character is. This is what a narrative is. This is what 3-act structure is. This is how it works. And then along with that, I have my side commentary. And the reason I do that is because as much as I want a revolution, right? I want liberation. I also understand that like my job as an educator is to give people all of the tools that I can. And so I'm not going to withhold on these rules. So if people do want to break into the industry, they do need to have a really strong understanding of what the rules are. They need to be able to masterfully implement those rules. And if they ever want a hope of subverting those rules or undoing them, they do need to know what they in fact are. And so I do it with commentary. And that I will say that when I've been, especially, I've done a bit of teaching. I do a bit of teaching for some organizations and film organizations in Chicago devoted to creators with intersectional identities and who know nothing, who come in, they haven't been to school, they're not planning to go to school. And the kinds of conversations that come out of that are incredible.
That leads me to another thing that you bring up in the book is centering different forms of agency. And I wonder if you can kind of explain that.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, one of the things I thought about a lot when writing this book was the way, again, this is really rooted in character and character building. So let's see, the best way to approach this is, if you're a new-ish screenwriter, chances are at some point you've been told that your main character is too passive. All right. And sometimes that is just true, right? That sometimes you just haven't really developed the character at all. You should develop all of your characters. But oftentimes this is actually a code for something else. And this idea of a character must be an active agent is very deeply embedded into character building practice. And the idea of an active agent is basically a masculinist and white supremacist idea. And so this idea of active and agency forces all characters to act on the world and act on other people. Agency in this conception is dominance and mastery. And what immediately comes to mind to me when I think about this is that that's not how all of us get to live our lives. And honestly, I say get to live. I think it's I don't know that everybody wants to live their life like that. And so, and not wanting to dominate or being prevented from enacting agency does not make you inactive, and it does not make you a non-agential person. So in the book, I talk about it a lot. Had too much coffee. In reference to stories about like domestic violence and domestic violence survivors, and think about like the stories that come to mind, the movies that come to mind are like Enough with Jennifer Lopez, or this is going to age me, but like I think a lot about like The Burning Bed from, I don't know if that was the 70s or the 80s with Farrah Fawcett. Yeah. And this idea that we only see these stories told if the woman like has like broken and decided to like, dominate and destroy her abuser. But that's simply not the reality for most women who experience domestic violence, and instead acts like a smile or a prayer or saying nothing. Right. Those are actually profound acts of agency, because those are the things that are keeping that woman alive. And we need, as screenwriters, to figure out how to dramatize that, because that is just as much a valid form of agency as, brutality. To me, it's a more important form of agency than brutality, to be honest.
Right. And it's actually the lived experience probably of a more majority of the world than it isn't. And so because, at the end of the day, as you know, and you make mention in this book, like representation matters for us all to be able to see ourselves and to see. And if the only stories we're seeing, if we're experiencing domestic violence, and the only stories that we're seeing is we have to fight and we have to win against our aggressors, how much shame are we putting on the women who choose otherwise, right? Yeah. And what harm are we doing? What greater harm are we doing?
Yeah, I love how you put that. I love how you put that. Absolutely.
You talk about agency and you talk about character versus characterization. I also love how you talked about, because this is something that I feel like as a female screenwriter over the years, I have always been drawn to these kind of stories where it's tension versus conflict. And a lot of times I feel like I've had to fight to keep to say, no, it's there. I'm not having outwardly conflict, but there is tension. And I didn't have the words to really explain it there for a long time. So I wonder if you could talk about that paradigm.
Yes, no, that is such again, and that's very directly related to this idea of character as essence and our very limited concepts of agency, is that the whole narrative engine, right? So when I say narrative engine, I mean the thing that generates energy in a screen narrative, according to screenwriting, is conflict. And they won't even entertain anything else. And again, that's why you get these notes about you need, raise the stakes. You need more obstacles. You need more conflict. And that's just that's like a main note that people get, right? That you're not building conflict, because that there's, again, this very a total, I think, failure of imagination around what can generate momentum and what can generate energy. And so basically I make this distinction between conflict and tension. And ultimately, conflict creates tension. If you go to the root of these two words, conflict and tension, conflict, in the Latin, its original Latin means to strike, right? And so this means like bringing things into contact, and one thing like striking another. And again, this calls up like assault, it calls up domination, it calls up violence. Tension, on the other hand, again, from the Latin, means to reach towards. And that's a very different feeling, right? We can reach towards someone we love. We can reach towards healing. We can reach towards something unattainable, right?
Right.
And it's the reaching that actually is the energy of a narrative. And yes, conflict can create that reaching, but so can a lot of other things. And so I talk to, and I can't tell you how much when I say this in any kind of screenwriting class context, students, like, you can sense this like relief and this recognition of like this frustration that they've all had, because they do know that conflict is not the only way to generate tension. And so I ask screenwriters to think about what are the other things that human beings do that generate tension, like love and healing and grief and friendship. And how can we explore those phenomena and tease out the way that those phenomena generate tension and use that tension to move our narratives. And here I think we could have so many more amazing stories.
I just started teaching my first class yesterday with a new group of students. And one thing that I always ask is, what's your favorite movie and why? Because to me, that's a great way to get a little bit of a personality test, get a little bit of sense of where everybody is and what kind of stories they gravitate to. And I always get asked as well, but one of my go-tos is Arrival. And I say that movie because traditionally alien movies, it's always the aliens are coming. We need to be aggressive. Like, we need to fight. We need to save Earth. We need to, that sort of thing. And here's a movie that's saying, how about we try to communicate? So yes, the reality of like the wanting to fight, the wanting to protect, the wanting to save is there in the background. But here we have this linguistics professor who's coming in, and the whole thing is the tension of communication and how we are not communicating properly with one another. And it's an incredibly tense movie, and the stakes are high, and it's not anything about fighting.
Yeah, I love that. And I love showing that movie to students. And I think it's what's great about that too, is it also illustrates so much of what I talk about in terms of like, the conflict is there in the background. It's what the men are doing.
Yes.
Right? They're doing, that's what their activity is all in the background around conflict. And then we have our protagonist who's doing something so fundamentally different. And again, if you think about like tension as that reaching towards, like communicating is a reaching towards, right? And a trying to connect.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit, because you have some examples. I love that you set up your book. Like, the first half of the book is really like, we're in a graduate level class. We're really talking about, we're going to the weeds, we're dissecting, we're breaking down other, screenwriting texts and the tomes that are used. And then the second half of the book, you're giving you're really just diving deep into real world examples. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you want to talk about like your favorite example. I know you have 4, but like, if like there's one that you want to talk about and why to you it's such a thing to hold up.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to say just kind of a general thing. For one, it was really important to me, and I do this throughout the book. I spend most of my time praising good work. And to me, that was very important, because I think too much of everything in the world is about tearing everything down. And again, I want to heal the world in my own little way. And so it was very important to me to have generative, positive examples, and that did a variety of things so that different people could access them in different ways. And the only contradiction to that is the chapter on Killing Eve, but I also felt that was really important to have that critique there. But most of my examples are positive and generative.
Right.
Out of those, I mean, I think I would say my favorite chapter to write would be the one on Michaela Cole's I May Destroy You. I think that show is a complete masterpiece. If you haven't seen it, I recommend watching it, although it is also, because of the way that it deals with sexual assault, it is a difficult.
Do not binge it.
Yeah.
One episode at a time.
You can't. I don't feel like you can. Like, I know when I was watching it, I had to stop and walk away. And there was episodes I had to be okay, I need to step away. But yeah, I think it's just a masterclass in thinking about one, the role of one's intersectional identity and how it interacts with the world, and the world that this is set in is a world of rape culture. And that is part of the world building. And so I have a whole chapter on world building and how I think we don't think about that enough in screenwriting. And so really showing how she is so attentive to the nuances of race and gender, and immigration status, and even being in a colonial context, and what it means to move through the world as a Black British woman. I think it's really brilliantly done. And it shows that those things are not something that we should shunt to the side, but that they are central to telling meaningful stories. And then the other thing in that chapter that I really love is talking about the way she handles agency, and the way that she shows constantly the fluidity of one's ability to act as an agent in the world, depending on your company, depending on who you're with, and depending on where you are at any given moment. And all of the characters just kind of flow back and forth between being their own subject and an object to somebody else. And I've never seen anything like that.
It felt to me like there was so much of especially at the beginning of the show, and I think a lot of us can relate to, is this cloak of denial, denying how the world sees us, as a way to protect ourselves. And so much of that show, because I think I heard that she never saw herself as a woman. She only really saw herself as being Black in the world, but through this show, right? But through this show, was confronted with that, how she walks through the world as a woman, and how that affects who she is. And so I felt that discovery through the show, and understanding that she had this we sometimes tell lies to ourselves, because I think a lot of us maybe felt it around the Me Too movement. Well, I don't know what they're talking about, that sort of thing. But then really it's that you were not thinking about all of the times it's happened to you, because you can't, because if you did, would you just crumble into a ball into the corner on the floor? So so that's what I really appreciated about that show, is really helping rip off the blindfold that you put on yourself.
Well, and the blindfold that every single other show or movie has put on all of us, by not acknowledging the harmful structural forces in the world and the way that they impact different people with different identities in vastly different ways.
Right. And I think you talk a little bit about this, I believe, in the book as well, but this strong female character too, right? That the only way, and I grew up with a mom who she became an attorney in the 80s when it was not done by women, and she had 2 little kids in law school as well. And she taught me from a very early age that I need to not be blonde, that I need to dress not dress in frilly, like have the shoulder pads, try to dress as masculine as possible. Because if I want to exist in the world and be successful, I need to be a strong woman. And then our films perpetuate that, right? Like the only way that we can have a film about a woman is if we could just interchange it with a male actor.
Yeah. And I think, again, that goes to that notion, our very limited concept of agency. And because we have this sort of universal, neutral definition of agency, which is really based off of cis white males' conceptions of themselves, then we lose out on all of these stories about people who, again, are not interested in domination. And so, yeah, I do think the whole strong female lead, I mean, the fact that it's a genre on Netflix or whatever, it's ridiculous. It's absurd. And again, I think that's like part of this overall kind of these insidious forces that like make it so hard to do anything different. Right. Because then if you're writing a show about a woman, you have in your mind like, oh, but I have to have a strong female lead, right?
Is there like a further goal, like a further hope that comes out of starting these conversations? If you could write the next chapter.
My hope for this book is that it causes a lot of new and generative conversations about the rules of screenwriting and how they can be upended, reimagined, reconceptualized, so that people have the tools to start telling stories that more fully account for more of lived experience. So I want there to be new conversations and new practices that come out around like, how do we build character and how do we build characters in a way that, accounts for different intersections of identity. I want more conversations about world building and the importance of really thinking about the world and the way that the world acts on different people with different identities in different ways. I want people to rethink narrative structure. And I don't have any illusions that like 3-act structure is going anywhere. And I don't actually have any problem with the basics of 3-act structure. It's just a beginning, a middle, and an end. What I have an issue with is what has been sort of conceptually fused into those 3 acts. And can we rethink what a first act does, what a second act does, what a third act does, and so on and so forth. And out of that, my hope is that this is in my mind, this is the beginning of a conversation that has not been had. And so I would love to see people trying new things. I would love to see if any other scholars take this up and want to write and pull this work further. I'd love to see screenwriters engaging with this and writing stories that embody these new ideas. So I'm hoping it inspires change and growth and conversation.
And I think an important part of that conversation, which you kind of bring up in the Killing Eve chapter a little bit, is that entire writer's room, while women were straight cis women telling bisexual, lesbian storyline.
Yeah.
And so the conversation, which is a difficult one to have, and I think something that we in Seattle should be having more, because we definitely have a very white industry here, whether we do have a lot of women in the industry, but very white. That conversation about what stories we should be writing.
What I see a lot of, in particular, white women and sometimes white men, but white women mostly, sort of recognizing like, oh, there's this quest for diversity now. So we have to like put lesbian characters in our stuff, or we have to put Black people in our stuff. And the thing is, the truth of the matter is, if you don't have the lived material experience of people who sort of live in the social hierarchy on a lower rung than you do, I don't think you have a right to tell their story. I think like if there were like a Black trans woman in the audience today who wanted to write any of our stories, I'd be like, go right ahead, because you can see us very clearly, because we've been horrible to you, right? But the more privilege you have, the higher you are on the sort of the social hierarchy. I think you have a very limited view of what life is like. And so I think you should stick to telling stories that are as close as possible to your lived material experience. And within that, I say for, like mostly I'm talking here to white women. For white women, like we still don't have good stories about white women.
Right.
So you have a whole playground.
Right.
Yeah. And I know people don't always want to hear that. So I just want to I know that that's not what people want to hear, but I think I think it's an ethical responsibility. And we need to, as much as possible, any kind of power we have, whether it's through whiteness or cisness or straightness or whatever, we have to use that to bring other people into the industry who are more marginalized than ourselves, to let them tell their own stories. And so, if you have, like, I had someone I was consulting with who had worked for the a white woman who had worked for the Chicago Housing Authority and really wanted to tell a story about redlining because she saw it firsthand. And she realized that the story she wanted to tell, she didn't want it to be about a white woman, because then it would become like this white savior narrative. And she understood that would be gross. So she understood that it needed to be focused on a Black woman. And she was like, but what do I do? And I was like, do you know any Black female writers who might like to collaborate with you?
Right.
And then she was like, oh, okay. And so she went out and she found a Black female collaborator, and she explained like what she wanted to do, why she knew she wasn't the person to tell this story. She was honest about like the limits of her lived material experience and why, this other woman's perspective was going to be essential. And they began collaborating together. And so I think you have to be open to having really honest conversations about your own limits. And I think collaboration can be a really great way to tell stories that maybe otherwise you would try to tell on your own and just do further harm.
We need to get off of the stigma. And television has figured out with the writer's room that it's okay to have a bunch of writers. Can we stop this stigma that feature films can only have one writer? Yeah. And that it's somehow bad if you have multiple writers in the writer credits? I think it just makes it easier for all of us to have multiple writers. And also feature films do have multiple writers.
Yes. They just hide that process.
Yes. Because we're under this, again, this auteur theory that we have to do everything by ourselves. And that's the only way that it can be great, is if we came up with everything on our own. But there is no director out there that's done anything on their own. They've done it with the entire. So yes. Chris had a good question. If at this point audiences have been trained by one type of story, how do we get audiences to accept new types of stories and storytelling that challenges their desires?
This goes back early to the thing of like, get really good at your craft. Like if you're a comedy writer, get really good at telling jokes. If you're a drama writer, get really good at like capturing like strong emotions and relations. Sorry, there's a very strange noise coming from my neighborhood. But yeah, I hear that. I do think audiences have been trained to want certain things, but also like when you look at, especially on television now, the range of stories that are coming out, I do think people will watch. And I think the key is to, again, capture, like have a voice, have something to say, and to capture like human relations and human experience in a really profound way, and you'll be fine.
If it's good, like it won't matter what the wrapper that it comes in, right? Like we just have to be really good at at having the tension, having the agency, having the things that just make something compelling to watch. Going forward for you, this is something that has been a challenge for me. Is the pandemic was, and when everything shut down, because we're both in this collaborative, not only are we both educators, we're both filmmakers, and both of those are very collaborative mediums where you have to have people in a room together for either discourse or to make art. And when the pandemic hit, and also the pandemic, and then the world as it's crumbling around us, and thinking about the news today with Roe v. Wade, there's a little voice in my head that's like, maybe your voice is not what needs to be heard right now. And how do you grapple with that as an artist? Because that's your thing. That's you're wanting to you know, fly your freak flag so that other people can, with the same freak flag can be like, cool, someone else has it.
Yeah.
So what are you feeling right now as an artist, and going forward and understanding and diving deep into, there's such a void of a mass amounts of stories, and how are you finding your way as an artist in continuing forward in that?
Yeah, I do think about that a lot. And in terms of the voice of like, is your like that inner critic that's like, are you really the person that should be talking or whatever? I think if you're invested in healing and reparative justice, then talk, like, and use your voice. And because in order to fight the forces of, white supremacy and patriarchy and heteronormativity, a lot of us need to speak up. And we know in particular with white supremacy, like white people need to be talking to other white people and getting them to understand the harms that come with whiteness and white entitlement. So I think that's really important. And I don't think we can lose sight of that. In terms of, like my own creative work, with the pandemic, right before the pandemic, I was slated to make a series of dance films based on a larger performance piece that I had done with a choreographer here. We made a piece called Gag Rules, and it was about the different ways that the sort of the systems of power and institutions silence women. And then we were going to make the series of dance films based on it. And then the pandemic hit and it was like, yeah, we're not doing that. And I really have now shifted to thinking about writing more. And I really loved writing this book. I want to write another book. And in terms of where like my energy is going, and I do consider, even though, this is more analytical, I do still consider this deeply creative work. Just even if it's not a narrative, it is still the way I manifest my own creativity. And my next sort of project moving forward is I'm really interested in, again, this idea of imagining otherwise. And right now, for example, I'm working on a class that I'm going to teach in the winter called Screenwriting Utopia. And I want to start pushing people who are interested in speculative fiction of any kind to stop with the dystopian nightmares. We're living in one. We don't need to imagine worse. We need to imagine better. I want to see stories set in worlds that are organized around care and human flourishing, please. Yeah. And there will still be tension in those worlds because people are still going to be awful. But we can start showing, like, telling stories set in worlds that we actually want to live in.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for being a part of this inaugural episode of Beyond the Screen. And I'm very excited to continue this discussion. I loved having this discussion. I know that when I was reading the book, Chris and I were having very long discussions about various things. And I can't wait to have more because it's greatly needed, especially I hate that I have to continue saying now more than ever. Can we get to a point where we don't have to say that anymore? But thank you so much. And thank you for being a part of this.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate it. And also thank you to Chris and Lindy for just engaging in these ideas and reading the book. That makes me really happy.